to create the most viewed itineraries. Otherwise, everything worked out just fine. So I return a message stating that the most viewed itineraries were created. Alright, that should do it. Let's give this a try. I'm going to put a breakpoint at the start of our run orchestrator method here and at the start of HTTP start. Like that we can see what's going on. Alright, let's try this locally first. Alright, so as you can see, there's 3 functions here that we can execute via an HTTP trigger. The one we want to execute is the HTTP start one. So let me navigate to this to trigger the HTTP start. And we hit the breakpoint, HTTP start. Makes sense. Let's continue. We hit our run orchestrator breakpoint. That's also as expected. Let's continue. And we somehow hit this breakpoint again. We did see something appear. There's an output coming through the browser, but right after that we hit our breakpoint again. So what's going on here? Well, when doing this first HTTP call here, or rather when an await statement is encountered, the orchestrator function checkpoints its progress, by default via the linked Azure Storage account. So it stores its state and then goes to sleep. When the HTTP call completes, the orchestrator function wakes up again and replays from the beginning to the point where it left off. Like that, the orchestrator can handle failures and restart gracefully. But the fact that this method replays like this is something to keep in mind when developing. It's, for example, not a good idea to rely on something that will be different when replayed, like the current date time. If you want to write logic against that, you can at any given time do a call into the context variable .isReplaying. That will give you a value of whether or not this method is replaying. Let's continue. Here's our breakpoint again. Makes sense. We have 2 await statements. And if I continue again, we don't hit a breakpoint again. 2 await statements were all we had. So what do we see here? Well, when we sent a GET request to generate most viewed itineraries, we immediately got back this response. This response is a 202 response, which means the request was accepted. This is the result of this call here at line 77, the call into create check status response async. What this allows is monitoring the function and manipulating the execution of the function by sending GET or POST requests to one of these URIs. We see the instance ID, and we see URIs to purge the history by sending a delete request, sending an event by POST, querying the status with a GET request, and terminating the execution of the function with a POST. We are interested in the status because that will also get us the outcome. So let's send a request to this status query get URI, and there we go. Here is the output of our durable function. Most viewed itineraries were created. Everything ran successfully. We also see a runtime status of completed. Alright, with that our durable function is up and running. Let's publish this, and by the start of the next clip this will magically have been published. Let's look into monitoring durable functions next. So our durable function has been deployed. Let's trigger this and see what happens. There's multiple ways of triggering this, as you know. For this demo, I'll simply run it via the detail page. So I'll just send a GET request here and click run. We immediately get back a response as expected. This, by the way, is going to fail. So if I look at the status query get URI now and send a request to this, I should see some info on that. And there we go. What we see here are a bunch of interesting details. The instance ID, of course, and the runtime status failed as expected. And the input, that's the host address that we generated. Our function failed, and what we also see here is the full stack trace. That's already quite helpful in trying to figure out what went wrong. So this is already a convenient way of monitoring a function. In this case, I know what's going on. We're calling our two other functions, but anonymous access is not allowed when calling them. They require us to pass through a function or a host key, as that is how we set them up. Locally, all of this worked, because when developing, the function key does not need to be provided. But now we are no longer running locally. We published the app, and our orchestration function calls into two functions that require a key. So we need to pass that key. Let's do that. First, let me get the keys for the two functions. We know where to find them. So I click Get Itinerary function, function key, and I copy it. And then I do the same for our Create Most Viewed Itineraries function. I need a function key here as well. Let's copy it, and there we go. Let's add them to the settings file of our function app. So I add them as Create Most Viewed Itineraries function key and as Get Itineraries function key. And then let's use them in our durable function. So I want to inject an iConfiguration object here to get a hold of my configuration values. I can't inject in a static class, so let's not make these static anymore. There is no need for that, by the way. And let's inject an iConfiguration object. Let's store it in a field. And let me use that when getting the itineraries. Interesting. This code doesn't seem to work. Apparently, indexing cannot be applied to this iConfiguration object. This isn't the first time this has happened, and I'm sure it may have happened to some of you as well. Visual Studio is normally pretty good at figuring out which using statements to add, but in this case it made a small mistake. It added a using statement to castle.core.configuration, and that is not where my iConfiguration object resides. Instead, it resides in Microsoft.extensions.configuration. All right, so that took care of that. And then I'm also going to add that code when calling into most viewed itineraries. But of course, I don't want to add the get itineraries function key. I want to add the create most viewed itineraries function key. So let me copy that key over. All right. I'm also going to remove this say hello function here. We have no need for that anymore. And I'm also going to stop allowing anonymous access to trigger our durable function. If I allow anonymous access here, and I have the function keys to call the other functions, that would essentially mean that the other functions can be called anonymously through this durable function. And that's not what I want. I want to have a function key as a requirement for each function call. All right, let's publish this. But let's not forget to add the app settings to the environment variables over on the portal. We know how to do that. So I insert the local value remotely for the function key to create most viewed itineraries. And I do the same for get itineraries function key. Let's click OK here. And now let's publish. We're back over at the portal. Publication should have succeeded. Let me refresh this. And there we go. Here's our functions again. Let's trigger it. This time I'll go through get function URL. We need a function key, as you remember. Here that one is. Let me copy this. And let's paste this and execute it. And here we go. This seems to work again. Let's query the status. And our status is completed, just as expected. By the way, when working on Azure, especially right after having deployed something, you may see that the first time you run this durable function, you will get errors, especially if you're trying to run it very fast after having published it. Just wait a minute and try again, and it will work. It's just a matter of Azure underneath the covers that's still being busy with publishing the other functions, or having them time out because of a cold start. Anyway, this again works in a secure way. All right, back to monitoring. The main thing I want to say here is that monitoring durable functions is pretty much the same as monitoring non-durable functions. You can find the invocations, you can find orchestration information via the overview page, and that brings you to the invocations, which give you all the details of every request you send. So if I click this, you see a screen that should look familiar. And here too, we can go to Application Insights for even more information about this. And with that, it's time for the section summary.